Hello and welcome to Beginning Synthesis on Free Software. This is episode 1, Oscillators and more. So first to recap, last episode I introduced the software we'd be using and the software synthesizer we'd be using, and I discussed why I think learning on free software is a good idea. Let me give you another reason. If you buy yourself a beginner's piece of hardware synthesizer, you may find that once you use it to learn synthesis, you outgrow it. And then it becomes something that's no longer central to your music making setup. If instead you learn synthesis using free software, it's required no investment, but it's built an understanding of synthesis. And from that point, you will be able to understand what makes sense for you in a piece of hardware. I think hardware synthesizers are excellent. I have many of them, but I think that they are a high investment and I think it's worth making the right choice. So I'm hoping that in teaching synthesis here, I will also be teaching you how to make a more informed decision when you come to buy a synthesizer. So as I said in the last episode, I was going to draw in some notes here that we can use to drive the synthesizer that we'll be working with. So you may note that I've made several tracks, and those tracks are labeled thus: mono, legato, poly. So let me first introduce what that means. By default, a synthesizer is going to be able to play a certain number of notes. That number of notes is referred to as polyphony. When a synthesizer only has the capacity to play one note at a time, it is known as a monophonic synthesizer. It has one voice, like a human has one voice. When it is polyphonic, it has multiple voices in the way a choir has multiple voices. There are two variations on the monophonic mode that are often made available to you. One is called legato, and one is called regular mono, and this relates to the behavior of the envelopes. So to clarify, what that means is the envelope is the part of the synthesizer that shapes the sound in time in response to you playing a note or pressing a key. In legato mode, if two notes are overlapping, typically the envelope will not re-trigger, the pitch will just change. In non-legato mode, the envelope will stop and it will restart with the new sound playing. So that's a brief explanation. By way of demonstration, I will simply use the monophonic instance of Odin. By default, you have what's called an initialized patch. So an initialized patch can be achieved by clicking the Reset Synth button here. An initialized patch is a basic configuration and signal flow which gives you the most simplistic sound available. So I'm going to play the notes that I have here using this initialized patch. So a very basic melody, and you can hear that the sound is very bright and is very harsh. We will try and understand why it sounds like it sounds, and we will understand how and why you would make changes. We're going to do that by starting at the beginning of the synthesis signal flow. If you remember in the last episode, I said these upper three panels are the sound sources. We can use multiple sound sources simultaneously, and Odin actually has many other forms of oscillator, but we're going to stick to the analog oscillator for now because it's the most basic. So if I wanted, I could have more than one of these things. Adding multiple gives you a lot more possibilities, but it also adds complexity. So for now, we will begin with one oscillator, and we will listen to the effect that the parameters have. First, I'll give a little brief introduction to what this is. So on this side, we have volume control. When we have multiple oscillators, this is in particular very important. This allows us to adjust the ratio of the volume of the different sounds. When there's only one oscillator, often you don't need to adjust this. We have these three pitch controls on the top. So by default, when a note appears in the MIDI clip or I play a note on the keyboard, the oscillator will change its sound output to match that new pitch. We have ways here of offsetting the pitch from the note that we play. One of the controls adjusts it in octaves, so it can play 12 semitones above or below. The next one adjusts it in semitones, so this allows us to go up or down one semitone. And the final one is called fine tuning, which allows us to adjust the tuning in synths. This is commonly called detuning because it's taking us away from notes on that chromatic scale. In this case, we have this drift parameter. Drift is slightly more complicated to think about, but think about a piece of hardware synth and imagine an analog synthesizer. Analog synthesizers typically have some degree of instability in their tuning, and this, for certain purposes, can be an asset. So what the drift parameter here does is it makes the tuning slightly unstable on the oscillator. The final controls we have here are the controls to select the type of waveform that it outputs, and this other parameter called pulse width, which only applies to one of the waves. So first, let's listen to the waves and let's experiment with the tuning. This is a saw wave, a very buzzy waveform. This is called a square wave, and this is a very, I describe it as a hollow sounding waveform. Sorry, I should have looped that. Next is a triangle wave, less harmonic content, still has some shape. And finally, the sine wave. This is the simplest of the waveforms here, and it has the least harmonic content. Now let's experiment with octave. 1 octave up, 2 octaves up to 4 octaves up to 4 octaves down, but we can't even really hear it. So let's stick with the triangle. Now let's try semitones. Usually, while playing, you wouldn't be adjusting these. And finally, the fine tune. So this is in cents. What that means is that when we hit 50 cents, that is half a semitone up. Now, drift you won't really be able to hear. Let's jump back over to the square wave and let's adjust this pulse width parameter. So what is pulse width? A square wave has only two values. It's either high or it's low. And square means it has equal amounts of time spent high and low. Pulse width allows us to adjust the ratio of the time the waveform spends high and low. Exactly what that looks like is not particularly important, but what is important is how it sounds. So let's listen to it as we adjust this. So I would say it sounds You may notice the symmetry there. When I turn the pulse width very narrow or I turn it very wide, it sounds basically the same. And as we narrow that pulse width, it sounds more buzzy and very thin, as opposed to a little more round and hollow. You'll find a lot of strange adjectives used in sound design. So from there, we've already discussed now what an oscillator does and how it sounds. We've discussed the overall signal flow. The signal flows from the oscillator into the filter. We're not going to use the filter today. Into the other filter, which isn't there. Not going to use that today. Into the amplifier. One thing you may note is when the synthesizer is playing, there is no sound coming out now. Well, you may say, oh, well, the oscillator's not running. An interesting thing in synthesizers is typically the oscillator is always generating sound. The reason we don't hear sound now is the amplifier is attenuating fully that signal so we can't hear it. Well, I'm not adjusting gain and the gain doesn't seem to be at 0, so why is there sound at all? The reason there is sound is because of the envelope. An envelope which lives down in this section here, is a device which, in response to a note being triggered, either from the MIDI clip or from me pressing a key, is going to go through some motion. And in synthesizers, we have the concept called modulation. A modulation is applying that shape that is being generated to a parameter in the synthesizer. So in the case of the amplifier's gain is being controlled by the amplifier envelope. The envelope has a shape that's adjustable here, and it's adjustable through 4 parameters. This is very common also on hardware synthesizers. In fact, a lot of hardware synthesizers don't have an amplifier section. They just have the envelope adjusting the amplifier. So what do these 4 parameters mean? The 4 parameters are called attack, decay, sustain, and release. So what do they mean to you? Well, attack is what the envelope does when the note is triggered initially. So when the attack is very low, the loudness goes up rapidly. When the attack is high, the loudness goes up slowly. So when we're thinking of that string swell, we have a very slow attack. When we think of a plucked string, we have an attack that's almost 0. So attack can be thought of as a measure of how fast or slow we are ascending, or the amount of time it takes to ascend. So if we set this high, let's listen. So you can hear the swell happening initially. The next parameter is decay, which is probably the hardest to understand, so I'm going to circle back to that. We have a parameter here called sustain. Now sustain, unlike the other parameters which are adjusting a rate or a slope, sustain is an amount. And what it means is if we hold a key down or a note continues playing for a longer period of time, that is the volume or the level of that envelope that will be maintained. So let's play. So because I've set the attack, decay, and release all to 0, we're basically jumping to the sustain value. So when I set it low, it's quiet. When I set it high, it's loud. But to understand the decay parameter, we now have to understand sustain. So what happens when an envelope is triggered is it will increase along the attack curve until it reaches its maximum level. Then it will decrease along the decay slope until it reaches its sustain level. So decay is indicating how long it will take to reach from that maximum after attack down to the sustain level. So one could imagine, for example, that if I set the sustain level to maximum, it doesn't matter where I set decay because it will be going towards the 100% level, which it was at already. But if we set decay sustain somewhere else, if we set it to 0, for example, that's no volume, then the decay is going to control how long the note lasts after the attack phase. So if I set attack to 0, so this would be described as a plucky envelope shape. If I bring some sustain, we still have that pluck, but it maintains a certain level. Let's add a bit of attack to soften the front edge so you can hear a sort of opening and closing that happens there before it sustains to a certain level. The final parameter, release, is easy to be confused about. Why is it easy to be confused about it? Because when we draw an attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, it's easy to think that release is what happens after sustain. And that's not true. Release is what happens when the note ends or when I release a key. So if I'm in the attack phase and I release the key, the release phase is going to happen. If I'm in the decay phase and I release a key, release state phase is going to happen. If I'm in the sustain phase and I release is going to happen. And just like the attack and decay, you can think of it as the amount of time that it's going to take to go from that sustain level to 0. So let me start it playing and let me adjust this. So because let's listen to the third note from the beginning. Ready? 1, this one, and did you hear how that ended abruptly? That was because there was a rest in the music, but there was no release, so the sound terminated abruptly. Now I've added some release, you will hear that when the key is released, it continues to sound for some period of time. So I think that's a very basic example of a sound. I think it's not necessarily very interesting, but hopefully it lays the foundations for our understanding of synthesis. We understand the parameters in the oscillator section. We understand the meaning of the parameters in the envelope section, and we understand how to shape the amplitude envelope. As we get further through this series, we're going to be a little bit more deliberate in our approach to sound design, but for now, we're trying to understand the parameters. We're doing that by listening, and we're understanding intellectually so we can think about what impact any change we make will have on the sound. I hope this has been useful to you. I hope you'll join me for the rest of this series, but in any case, most importantly, I'd like to say thanks for joining me today and goodbye.